Good evening, and thank you for tuning in for week 2 as we continue our discussion on communication. Going to wait for a few more people to hop on, and then we're going to get started. I'm listening to a sanctuary as we wait, and I pray that this evening will be a blessing to you. Just listening to Sanctuary and waiting for a few more people to hop on, and then we will start. Give it about another minute. As we wait, if you can just share your thoughts on how culture impacts communication. This evening, we will be looking at direct and indirect communication. I want to thank you for tuning in for week 2 as we discuss communication and recognize how important communication is as we desire to strengthen and build our relationships. So let us go to the throne of grace. O gracious and wise God, our Creator, the God who created language and who allows us to have understanding, the God who allows us to have patience, the God who allows us to be able to hold what the other is sharing, the God who allows us to be respectful of one another as we desire to learn from one another. God, we thank you and we ask that you continue to reveal yourself to us, that we may strengthen how we communicate with one another. God, I pray and I ask that you will continue to lead and to guide us. Guide how we think, God, how we speak, God, how we relate to one another. And God, we will continue to give you all the praise and the glory, for we recognize that it is because of you, oh God, that we are able to have respect and compassion for one another, that we are able to be empathic, that we are able to be fully present and engaged as we continue to strengthen our ability to listen. as we continue to strengthen our ability to be present, as we have the desire to communicate, to learn, as we build our relationships, oh God. God, I pray that you'll continue to be present and that you will continue to speak. In your Son, Jesus the Christ's name, we pray. Amen. Again, I want to thank you for tuning in as we continue to discuss communication. How many of you know that communication is so important as we look at not just our relationships on a personal level, but how we communicate to people within our community, within our work, wherever we go, there's communication that's going forth. Whether it's positive or negative communication is going forth. So today I want to highlight indirect communication and direct communication and how culture and gender and subcultures impact how we communicate. So, indirect communication is simply communication that is not explicitly stated, whereas direct communication conveys a clear and direct message, right? So, again, indirect communication is not explicitly stated. And opposite of that is direct communication, which displays a clear and direct message. So let's start with indirect communication. So, indirect communication can cause a lot of frustration, especially when you're having a conversation or a dialogue with someone that practices direct communication, right? So, indirect communication may display the tone of voice that you use, your body language, your gestures, your facial expressions to communicate what you think or what you feel rather than just coming out and stating what you think or what you feel. Indirect communication can be frustrating if you're having a conversation or a dialogue with someone who practices direct communication because it leaves them guessing. How many of us have been trying to have a conversation with someone who was displaying the style of indirect communication? Right. And so part of indirect communication can lead to miscommunication and tension because of the lack of understanding or the frustration that comes from trying to guess what someone is trying to share. Rather than making a clear statement or stating a feeling, someone that's practicing the style of indirect communication acts out rather than directly stating what they feel or what they think, right? And this can be experienced through facial expressions, it can be experienced through gestures, it can be experienced through their tone and even their behavior. Right. And so, with this style of communication, they tend to be nonverbal gestures. They tend to use facial expressions because they want you to perceive what they think or how they feel. But something that I wanted to really highlight as we look at indirect communication is that a lot of times people who focus or have a style of indirect communication is because they desire for the conversation to be friendly. They're more relational. They want to maintain the relationship. They don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And so, even though they may have a lot to say, the concern that they have for the relationship or the one that is speaking or they are communicating with, they hold valuable, right? And we're going to get into how this impacts as we look at culture and also gender. But I want to shift for a minute just to highlight direct communication. And so people who use direct communication tend to be direct and task oriented. They tend to have a unfiltered way of communication. They tend to openly express how they feel or what they want, what they need. And they're not really focused on the other's feelings or even how they may be perceived, whether it's intentional or non-intentional, right? And so, both whether you look at indirect communication or whether you practice direct communication, Our culture impacts how we communicate. Our culture can shape or influence our style of communication, right? And so when we look at indirect communication, it's believed that it's used in cultures that have a high value on relationships, right? And I experienced um, this when I was traveling in India, how they didn't use the word no, right? So the answer may have been no, but they didn't come out and state no because they didn't want to offend, right? And so when we engage one another in conversation, I think that it's important for us to be mindful of culture. It's important for us to be mindful of culture so that we don't allow our perception not to just frustrate us, but to impact the dialogue or the communication, whether it's direct or indirect, in a negative way. Also, indirect communication can be used in terms of subcultures. You can have a different type of communication in your home, in your family, in school, at work, right? And so each of these micronisms of how we communicate can be heavily influenced by our culture, right? And by our culture, I mean, what are the set values that have been established in a set culture? You know, how do they perceive gender? How do they perceive age? How do they perceive how they communicate to an elder? Right. And a lot of times for me and my culture, in the African American culture, you know, I was raised to respect my elder. So I may not come, so my style of communication may not be direct in that moment, right? It may be indirect, right? Rather than coming out and clearly stating how I feel or what I think, I may use an indirect style of communication because I don't want to be disrespectful. And I'm very mindful and intentional about my tone of voice. I'm mindful about my gestures. I'm mindful about my nonverbal communication, right? Because we communicate verbally and we also communicate in a nonverbal manner, right? And so a lot of times when we look at indirect communication, this style of communication can also lead to projection if we're not able to recognize that this person may have this communication style based on all of these other elements that are unspoken but still present, right? That can impact how they talk, that can impact whether they have eye contact or not, that can impact their language, that can impact how they express themselves. Whereas someone that communicates directly can be clear and concise because the focus is not so much on the relationship, but the focus can really be on proving a point or getting their point across, right? So it's important as we engage one another in communication to be aware of unspoken elements that can be present in the conversation, right? And so it's important for us to recognize the power or the role or the impact of culture. And so when we look at culture, you know, we look at language, we look at gestures, we look at the words used, we look at phrases, but most importantly, we look at the meaning given to all of that, right? So what does the culture say about all of that? And so another way that culture impacts communication is also via gender, right? Because depending on our gender and our culture depicts how we communicate, how women communicate to men, how men communicate to women, and how the gender is perceived in that culture, right? So, culture, in terms of different concepts and understandings, because it's a set of shared beliefs, it's a set of learned behaviors, and then that learned behaviors or set of beliefs is played out in the dialogue moment, when two people or three or four persons come together to try to communicate, you have all of these unspoken elements that's present on why while we're trying to engage one another. So communication and culture is fluid, right? It's changing. It does not necessarily remain the same. So the way that culture impacted me coming up can be different the way the culture impacts the generation today and how they communicate. And if we was to just stop for a minute, I'm interested or curious in learning how you perceive culture and communication and how it may be different for you based on your ethnicity, based on your gender, based on your age and your social location. So just put it in the chat as we continue to just highlight indirect communication and direct communication. And I just want to highlight that either one is not right or wrong, right? It's and is, right? It highlights the importance of being respectful. It highlights the importance of being fully present and engaged and actively listening to the other so that we can learn from the other, right? And last week I talked about we communicate to learn. And that's why it's so important for us to be fully present and engaged in the dialogue as the other person is speaking, so that we can learn, so that we can be mindful, so that we can acknowledge not just the difference, but what's spoken as well as unspoken. Share your thoughts in the chat. How has culture impacted how you communicate? How has your gender impacted how you communicate? How has your age impacted how you communicate? Put your thoughts in the chat. And I know earlier I used my example for myself. So if I'm speaking to an elder, my role or my style of communication may be indirect because I'm mindful of that relationship. And so, how I may begin a conversation and communicate with the elder may be different than the communication that I may have with a peer, right? So we can interchange whether we use indirect or direct communication depending on who we are speaking with in that moment. Put your thoughts in the chat. Put your thoughts in the chat, because how many of us have experienced conversations with persons who may have direct communication and we became offended? Or how many of us have experienced indirect communication and we became frustrated because of the lack of clarity or the lack of directness? Put your thoughts in the chat. And as I remain silent, um, in the Japan or Japanese culture, silence is a way they communicate, right? Sometimes we think that if a person is silent in this Western culture, we can deem them as not listening. However, it can be a form of them trying to listen and trying to engage you by being silent, right? Put your thoughts in the chat as we explore indirect and direct communication and how culture and gender and age and all of these other elements are present as we desire to communicate, to learn from one another. Put your thoughts in the chat. I'm curious to know how your style of communication is present or different whether you're home or whether you're at work, or is it different? Or do you speak to persons the same no matter where you are, no matter the age, no matter the social location? Or do you find that it is different depending on your geographic location. So for me, I know when I came to the South from New Jersey, my language was different, right? I was perceived different based on how I spoke. Some people may have experienced my language or my way of communication as aggressive, right? Because I was direct or because I was a female speaking and engaging persons, having eye contact as a female, right? Recognizing that even though I may be speaking with another African American woman, but because of how she was socialized, because of her social location and how she was socialized and her culture here in the South is could be different from my culture and how I was socialized in the North. And sometimes I think that we think that we're all the same, right? We think that because we may be of a specific ethnicity or even from the same community or city or state, that we have the same style of communication, right? But the more we continue to engage and explore communication, the more we're going to see and to learn that we can even have different styles of communication and be from the same state. We can even have different styles of communication coming from the same family, right? And that can be based on our age. It can be based on our who we surround ourselves with, because we can have a culture and then we can have a culture within that, which is a subculture, right? And so it's really dependent on the meaning that we give to language. And a lot of times in these subcultures, the language can be different than the language that we learn at home, right? And all of it impacts how we relate to one another. And I've heard it said, especially when I do counseling with families, how there's a struggle or a disconnect when parents try to communicate with their children based on their age or because of how they was socialized and how they was raised and how they grew up. Some parents find it difficult or challenging to communicate with their children because of the gap, right? Because they may find themselves trying to guess what the child is trying to state. But I really just want to encourage us to highlight the importance of being patient, highlight the importance of practicing to understand, highlight the importance of mutual respect for one another, and highlight that we don't have to be right and our children have a wrong way of communicating. It's about being open to fully engage and learn from the other, right? No matter how old we are, we all have the opportunity to learn what they mean when they use certain phrases. Maybe a phrase that you use going growing up meant something completely different than a phrase that they use. Young people can take a phrase and twist it and give it a different meaning, right? Than what we have. That's why it's important for us to just be able to be open, engage one another, to be able to suspend judgment, to not think about communication in terms of right or wrong, but think about communication in terms of attempting and practicing to learn the other, to learn and to fully engage and to fully hear what the other is trying to state. And so when we look at culture and we look at gender, it's said that women tend to be more indirect and men tend to be more direct when it comes to communication. But I would state that it could be either or because I've experienced men who have practiced a style of indirect communication, and I've experienced women who practice a style of direct communication, right? So it's not necessarily that we have to tie one to the other, because communication is fluid and we can go back and forth in our communication style, whether it's direct or indirect, right? And so we know that communication and culture is fluid, it's ever changing, right? It's us who may um, be challenged with that. The ability to be fluid, the ability to change, the ability to be open and fully present and engaged, to be able to learn from the other, right? And another thing I wanted to highlight when it comes to gender communication is how women and men communicate differently based on how we express ourselves through our choice of words, right? Through our tone of voice, through our emotional expression, right? And so either male or female can practice the style of either direct or indirect, right? Male and female are shaped how we choose to communicate based on our culture, right? Because our culture teaches us the meaning of identity, and our identity, how we have been identified, can impact how we communicate with one another, right? And so, really, I just wanted to highlight the difference between indirect and direct communication, and how each of them can be interchangeable, and each of them can be influenced by our culture, and each can be influenced by our gender, by our social location, and our age and our upbringing. All impacts how we communicate to one another. And as we close this evening, I really want us to be intentional when we engage someone that may practice a different style of communication than us. Rather than come from a place of being defensive, we can learn how to relax and just be fully present, so that we can learn from the other, right? So we don't project our perceived knowledge of what is being shared based on our culture or based on our gender, but actually take the time to get to understand or practice understanding the other, and how their unspoken culture, or how unspoken subcultures, or even gender or age, can be present in that dialogue moment. So, as we end with week two, I'm excited about week three, because we'll be talking and exploring passive communication, passive aggressive communication, and aggressive communication. So, you'll notice that each week we'll be building upon the other. So, what we learned in week one and week two will be explored more in week three. I want to thank you for taking your time out. I pray that something that I said, that you learned, and that you begin to communicate from a place of openness, to be able to be fully present, to be able to listen to the other, to be mindful of communication, to be mindful of gestures, to be mindful of the spoken as well as the unspoken communication, to be mindful of age, to be mindful of social location and culture, and how it can impact how we communicate with one another, and to know that it's not about being right. It's about being fully present, being fully engaged, and practicing active listening, so that we can communicate to learn. Again, I thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on next Friday as we continue to build upon our knowledge when it comes to communication. I'll see you next week as we look at passive communication, passive aggressive communication, and aggressive communication. You enjoy your Friday evening. God bless.